Hello and welcome to the NevilleResearch.com video. Today I'd like to talk about the First Folio and its connections with Henry Neville. Now, as everyone knows, Shakespeare's First Folio came out in 1623. That is after Neville's death in 1615 and after Shakespeare's death in 1616. And we sort of have two sides of the debate about the First Folio. The traditional view is that it's just a weird thing that happened that had no connection with the author of the works, and just Shakespeare's acting company, everybody got together with Ben Jonson and put out this First Folio, and there's no connection with Shakespeare's children or anyone else related to Shakespeare, on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have Shakespeare authorship people finding hidden codes or analyzing the portrait of Shakespeare or trying to find some hidden meaning in the text and the poems. And I'm not going to take either approach. What I want to look at are the facts, the historical documents, and what we can tell about the people who were involved with the First Folio. So I'm not interested in anything except facts and documents today. And that's where we're going to go about this. So first of all, as everyone knows, the First Folio was dedicated to William and Philip Herbert, brothers. They are the children of Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke, and they are the nephews of Robert Sidney and the grandchildren of Henry Sidney. Now, all of these people, every single one I've mentioned here, is connected with Henry Neville. So Henry Sidney, their grandfather, was very closely connected with Henry Neville's father. Robert Sidney, their uncle, went to Europe with Henry Neville. Their other uncle who passed away, Philip Sidney, of course, is the famous poet, and he wrote a letter to Robert Sidney while Robert was in Europe, telling him to stay close to Henry Neville and their tutor, Henry Savile. And of course, this sort of relationship, even between the Sidney family and the Neville family, lasted for generations. So even Henry Neville's grandson was close friends with Robert Sidney's grandson. So this close family relationship is a multi-generational relationship and a real relationship. And we have lots and lots of documents to show this. I just want to show a few interesting things. This letter from 1613 is from John Packer, who used to be, at the time he wasn't, but before he had been Henry Neville's secretary, and Ralph Winwood, who also had been Henry Neville's secretary. And he's telling Winwood in this letter about an incident around Thomas Overbury. And of course, Thomas Overbury ended up getting poisoned to death. But this is before his death, and the king had ordered him to become an ambassador, and Overbury said no. And so the king put him in the Tower of London sent him to the Tower as a prisoner. And who went to visit him? That evening, my Lord of Pembroke and Sir Henry Neville were with him, and so were again this morning. So who went to visit Thomas Overbury? Henry Neville and William Herbert. And, Henry Neville was much older than William Herbert, but they were allies in politics. They were connected to the Virginia Company together. These people were very connected, and I have lots more evidence of this. But I just wanted to show you this one letter that makes this point very clearly. Now, there's another very interesting thing. After Henry Neville died in 1615, his son was not doing too great. Henry Neville left a lot of debts, and the son was not really didn't have any political power, but it was the Herbert brothers who were his true patrons. So this is from the History of Parliament online, and they mention two things here. So first of all, Philip Herbert appointed Neville a gentleman of the Privy Chamber in extraordinary in 1628. So this is sort of a patronage relationship. Certainly Philip Herbert wasn't getting anything for himself from this deal, but he had obviously had the strong family connection with the Nevilles, and so he helped out the son of the family friend and made him a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. And then the next year, Henry Neville's son actually died. And who took up the wardship of his son, of Henry Neville's grandson? William Herbert. So William Herbert took the wardship of Henry Neville's grandson when Henry Neville's son died. And then after that, Herbert's secretary actually married Henry Neville's daughter-in-law and took over the wardship. So we have just a very, very close connection here between Henry Neville and William Herbert and his brother Philip. And this, like I said, is a multi-generational thing going on. So we look at this First Folio, and who is the First Folio dedicated to? Well, it's dedicated to William and Philip. And then what do we have here down here? But since your lordships have been pleased to think these trifles something heretofore, and have prosecuted both them and their author living with so much favor. So what do we have here? What is this dedication saying? It's saying that the Herbert brothers, were offered so much favor to the author when he was alive. Now, is there any evidence that William and Philip Herbert were great patrons of William Shakespeare? Of course not. Is there evidence that they were connected to Henry Neville when Neville was alive? Yes, and there's a lot of evidence that relationship continued, as I've just shown you, after his death. So this is one of the most important pieces of evidence for Henry Neville's authorship of the works of Shakespeare. This connection with the Herbert brothers is very important, and it's something that I'm going to be talking about a lot in the future, but I just wanted, in this video, I'm just going to stop here with this information and go on to the next parts of the First Folio. Now, obviously, the main poem to William Shakespeare was written by Ben Jonson, and Jonson probably had a big role in putting the First Folio together. The First Folio is very similar in format to Jonson's own folio of 1616. So it makes sense that he would be involved in this. He knew very well everything about the plays. He was writing plays at the same time. He knew William Shakespeare personally, for sure. But it's a very important point here, and I talk about this in much more greater detail in another video, is that Ben Jonson wrote an epigram to Henry Neville, and it's one of the most sort of non-ironic, just straightforward and touching epigrams of his book of epigrams that was included in Jonson's 1616 folio. So I'm not going to read it here, but you can see this epigram here, and you can watch the full video. And the point is that Henry Neville was connected to Ben Jonson, and we don't know all the details of that connection, but this epigram makes this very, very clear. So as another piece of the puzzle, Ben Jonson also knew, respected, and I would say loved Henry Neville, judging by this epigram. Here is another poem written by Leonard Digges. And who was Leonard Digges? Once again, He's somebody who had a multi-generational, just like the Herbert brothers. He was somebody much younger than Henry Neville, but had a multi-generational connection with Henry Neville because his father was Thomas Digges. And Thomas Digges was a famous mathematician, astronomer, and sort of military tactician. And this is just a Wikipedia entry, but so in 1583, Henry Savile, John Chamber, and Thomas Digges were on a commission to evaluate whether England should adopt a Gregorian calendar. And, you know, Henry Savile and John Chamber were two of Henry Neville's best friends. John Chamber went with him to France when he became ambassador, and when John Chamber died, Henry Savile and Henry Neville were the executors of his will. And Henry Savile, of course, Neville traveled with him in Europe from about 1578 to 1582, and they remained friends their whole life. So there's just no question here that Thomas Digges knew Henry Neville. They were in the same social circles, they were the same political circles, and it's very likely that Thomas Digges knew Henry Neville's father. And then we have a lot of evidence connecting Henry Neville with Leonard Digges' brother, Dudley. So I found this document in the National Archives, and it's sort of a deposition relating to Thomas Overbury, who was, poisoned to death. And so this deposition is actually after Henry Neville's death. So it's from November of 1615. But in this deposition, Dudley Digges, the older brother of Leonard, is talking about a conversation he had with Henry Neville about Thomas Overbury. So he's sort of recounting a very close, friendly conversation he had with Henry Neville. So there's just no question that Henry Neville knew Dudley Digges and was connected with him. Dudley Digges also was very connected with the Virginia Company, which Henry Neville was very involved with. And I have another document here. This is from the Parliament record, and in 1614, Henry Neville sort of got in trouble because in 1612 he had met with the king and given him sort of some advice, some document about how to deal with the Parliament, some proposal. And in 1614, people found out about it and found out that it was Henry Neville who did it, and there was debate in Parliament about this. And there were two people who really stood up the most for Henry Neville. John Hoskins, who defended Neville, and Dudley Digges. And Dudley Digges said that he thought that a private man might go and move the king for the good of the country, uncalled. And what's interesting is he mentions his father, and did instance his father, who projected diverse things to Queen Elizabeth, and yet was a Parliament man after. So he's giving his father as an example of somebody who spoke with the Queen directly and gave her advice when he was alive. So Dudley Digges definitely is somebody who was politically connected to Henry Neville, and it's a family relationship. It goes back to the father, Thomas Digges here. And then we have Leonard Digges, who was a poet himself and a translator, writing the poem for the First Folio. So once again, person after person, they're all connected with Henry Neville. And last but not least, we have the poem by Hugh Holland. And who is Hugh Holland? Well, here's Hugh Holland, and here's Henry Neville. This is a list of the people who went to the so-called Philosopher's Feast, or the Convivium Philosophicum in 1611. All the leading wits were there, including John Hoskins. We talked about him in relation to Dudley Digges. Christopher Brooke, who was connected to the Virginia Company with Henry Neville, and also was Neville's political ally in Parliament. John Donne, the famous poet, was there. So we have a lot of the really top wits of the era were there. And who was there? Henry Neville and Hugh Holland. So this is another example where Neville is connected to the people who were connected to the First Folio. So obviously this all could be coincidence, but that's where research comes in, and we're starting with the basis of real documents and real evidence, and we're going to move forward with that to find out how was the First Folio put together, who was involved, why were the poems written the way they were. We're going to be looking at facts and documents and evidence to figure this out going forward. So thank you so much for coming to my channel here. Please click like and subscribe and tell your friends.